welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Justin Clark,
And I'm Mattimore Cronin.
and today we're discussing the future of news. So that means we'll be discussing how the creation and distribution of news is changing, how the ways that people consume news is changing, and how new technologies are redefining what it means to even be a journalist. So first, let's start off with news consumption.
Yeah,
Mattimore, how do you think it's changing currently?
right. So even just in our lifetime and our parents' lifetime, it's a totally different paradigm when you look at the news landscape. So in our parents' time, there were basically three major news stations. Everyone watched those three stations, and that created a collective version of reality that everyone shared. And we were able to get a ton of things done. I mean, we were able to put a man on the moon. We were able to get past the Cold War. So, and a lot of the concerns around that time were that there was too much groupthink, meaning people had too many overlapping opinions, and there might not have been as many sort of nuanced or diverging opinions. After
Yeah.
those three networks, then Fox News came into the mix, and since then it's gotten much more expansive as far as different news outlets. So we
Yeah.
went from just a few news stations to then now we have the whole internet. And
Yeah.
it's interesting that from a high level, when you look at what's happening, there was one worldview that was still dominant, even with all the news channels and that we had up until the 2016 election. And in the 2016 election, there seemed to be a rift in the fabric of reality, where now there's a conservative way of viewing of the news and everything that's
Mhm.
going on, and there's a liberal way or mainstream media way to take
Yeah.
in everything that's going on.
Mhm.
And this has had some upsides and downsides. I mean, the downsides are that people tend to be pushed more towards one extreme or the other.
Right.
And oftentimes that leads people to having opinions that aren't rooted in fact. But on the upside, there's just a flourishing number of new ways that people can consume media. And so there is this undercurrent of people who really want informed opinions and are willing to listen to
Mhm.
1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour podcasts and really go deep on a
Right.
subject rather than just getting these like snackable sound bites that you would typically see if you just watched, televised news interviews. So
Mhm.
there's some good stuff going on with this undercurrent of people that really want nuanced opinions, but then we're also being pulled in many different directions, and as a result, it's really hard to get things done because if you can't even agree on the facts of whether climate change is happening or on the facts of whether we have a problem on the southern U.S. border or not, then how
Mhm.
can you even begin to solve the problem?
Yeah. No, I mean it's crazy just how much information is available. That's I think one of the biggest problems we have and what the biggest problem journalists face too
Hmm.
is the fact that there's so much information and how like what do you focus on as a journalist and what do you focus on consuming? And it seems to be the way the model is now, we are, with traditional news outlets, fed certain types of media, the ones that are the most sensational and will get the most views. But like you said, we're also moving into, as consumers, the more long form formats like podcasts or
Hmm.
some of the stuff that I see that's pretty interesting is like these comedy type news networks. So like
Like
last
satire.
yeah, like Last Week Tonight or The Daily
Right.
Show or Real Time with Bill Maher. Like all of these things are kind of a way to be up to date on things without the same spin on it that you would see from like a Fox News or a CNN or anything
Right.
else.
And it
It's just kind
doesn't
of
it
like a
doesn't
funny
hurt
way.
your psyche as much either. When you're watching satire, you laugh
Uh-huh.
rather than being like, "Oh my God, this is so horrible. I had no idea Obama was a Muslim born in Kenya." Like which, by the way, in 2016, 50% of Trump supporters believed that fact. So that just
Really?
shows
Wow.
how much fake news has become an issue. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah,
How do you deal with like what is your own consumption of news and how do you parse all of this stuff that's going on and all of this
Yeah,
information that's available?
that's a really good question. So, my personal news consumption patterns are I listen to a liberal leaning and a conservative leaning podcast pretty much every single day so that I can
Hmm.
see what both versions of reality are thinking.
Hmm.
And the liberal side is the New York Times, the Daily podcast,
Yep.
which I love. And
Hmm.
then on the conservative side, I listen to Scott Adams, Coffee with Scott Adams. And I think
Yeah.
he's one of the smartest guys on the conservative side. Sometimes I listen to Ben Shapiro too. I really admire that he is willing to go against Trump if he thinks that what Trump is doing is wrong, but he'll also praise Trump when Trump does a good job with North Korea or with something else. So,
Hmm.
and I think that's a common thread that I've seen with the whole intellectual dark web is that
Hmm.
what sets these people apart is that they're not just cookie cutter pundits. They don't just
Right.
go along with whatever their party line is. Sam Harris will say when he's wrong. Um, you know,
Yep.
all of these, a lot of these people will evolve their thinking over time as new facts come in, and they're not
Hmm.
always going to go with what someone who considers himself a liberal to say to be true, or what someone who considers himself a conservative would say to be true. They go with whatever
Hmm.
they think is true based on all the information and all the nuances of whatever the context are of any situation that they're addressing. And that's
Hmm.
something that I think people really crave. And it's funny that even if you look at mainstream media, there are some inklings, some hints that they might be going into that more nuanced direction. Like
Hmm.
Fox News brought on Donna Brazile, who is like a, liberal pundit. I know that New York Times has started bringing on some conservative writers that are really,
Hmm.
pissing off a lot of their more liberal followers. But ultimately,
Yeah.
this is a good thing. It's good to
Yeah.
have real people with nuanced opinions on both sides because that's how you'll get an accurate representation of whatever issue you're discussing.
Yeah, and that kind of solves that whole groupthink issue that you mentioned in the beginning that our
Hmm.
parents' generation grew up with. When we have diverse opinions, we can actually figure out what is true rather than what does my party think is correct. And
Right.
this bias tendency that we have seen is one of the things that kind of kept me from really, reading or watching the news, especially on mainstream channels. I find myself just getting depressed when I see how biased Fox News is, or I mean, even biased how CNN
I feel
is,
like
or like
Rachel
all of these things.
Maddow is the classic example for the liberal side where,
Hmm.
I think she's very smart and well intentioned, but she goes a little bit too far sometimes
Hmm.
with connecting all the dots of Russian collusion. And I think that's kind of the biggest example of where the liberal side went a little too far is that, like, yeah, Trump is someone who is going to do whatever is best for himself. And he's definitely a narcissist. He's definitely a petty criminal. But he might not be as bad as people like Rachel Maddow are making him out to be, like premeditating the. I mean, who knows about that
Yeah.
situation? But my only point is that the left goes a little too far on the left side, the conservatives go a little too far on the other side, and I find myself seeing the only saviors as those people who are in the so-called intellectual dark web who actually
Hmm.
have full 1 hour to 3 hour long conversations where they explore an issue from every side, and that's the
Yeah.
only way that you can really have a full view of what's going on.
Yeah. I feel like I'm not super informed since I don't really pay attention to the super biased media. I feel like I don't really see the bias as much frequently just because, like you said, I listen to these more neutral thinkers that are part of
Hmm.
the center. And I like that. And I think I saw a stat one time where like 70% of Americans would view themselves as centrist, but it's just no one wants to say it to each other. Like if you're in a conservative family, you don't want to say that you have some liberal tendencies, or if you're in a liberal family, you don't want to say that you have conservative tendencies. So everyone just kind of stays quiet about it and consumes media on their own. But when we have these podcast hosts like Sam Harris, and I would even venture to say Scott Adams isn't that conservative. I would say he's just like reasonable with, a lot of
Oh
he's
yeah, I
probably
mean,
conservative fiscally, but socially he's
right.
not super conservative.
No,
So
I mean
he's
he
another centrist.
yeah, I mean I love his opinion on the abortion issue, which is that let's just let the women decide. Men don't have any extra information to add here. If the women decide it's right, then it's right. If the women decide that it should be outlawed, then it should be outlawed. But there's no reason for men to tell a woman what to do. Like, they should
Yeah.
decide for themselves as the biological partner that has been given the decision making power with this,
Hmm.
facet of life. It should be
Hmm.
up to them. So I really like some of his opinions like that, and he'll go against the grain. Um,
Hmm.
but it's pretty amazing when you look at the reach of some of these people. It's absolutely incredible. Like, for instance, the New York Times, they have about 4 million monthly subscribers, and they're
Okay.
approaching that number of listeners for even a single episode of the New York Times The Daily Podcast, which is like 3.8 or something and growing.
Hmm.
So it's already like, then they're not really, I mean, they definitely make money from their podcast. I think they brought in $10 million last year, but it's not nearly as much as what they make from their print and digital subscriptions, which are the bulk of their money. So on the business model side, it seems like the traditional media are having their new forms of media being subsidized by the old forms of media, but the old forms of media are dying out, and they're going to need to replace them with the new forms of media. And it's having a lot of ripple effects through the whole news food chain.
Hmm.
Like, if you're Ben Shapiro and you have the Daily Wire, you're very well positioned because you don't pay journalists to go out and find what the real situation is in any, place that's newsworthy. Like, when there's an active shooter, like, real traditional news organizations hire journalists to go out there, interview people, find out what's going on. And most quote unquote news organizations now, they don't do anything closely resembling that. They
Hmm.
instead just take whatever information is already available online, and then they'll just respin it with whatever they think, whatever preconceived notions they already have. And
Hmm.
it's not a terrible thing. I mean, we do something kind of similar on this podcast, which is based on, our experience and our worldview, and people tend to be willing to pay more for opinion than just like straight facts.
Right.
But I am a little curious about how this is going to ripple through the news industry when they're not spending as much money paying reporters to go out and figure out what the real situation is. And instead, we're left with primary sources that oftentimes have an agenda. Oftentimes, it's
Hmm.
like, Facebook marketers or PR agencies or big corporations that are trying to scapegoat some group so that they don't rise up and demand higher taxes for the wealthy or whatever it may
Hmm.
be. Um, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I was doing a little bit of research into just the structure of the news industry.
Hmm.
And it seems like there aren't, so there's a whole bunch of local news outlets
Right.
that, those are kind of the foundation of everything. But it turns out that a lot of these local news outlets are owned by bigger and bigger corporations, like
Right.
as these, you can go up the food chain all the way up to, giant. I don't know who the top
Like
companies really are.
Sinclair or
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess Sinclair is particularly scary. Have you seen that
yeah.
video? So basically, there was a last year some video came out where there were probably hundreds of news stations, but they're all fed the same
Yeah, the
lines.
must
Like,
run segments.
yeah, and basically this some YouTube creator overlaid all of these different these local news outlets saying the same thing, and they sounded like drones. Like, they're all saying we are,
Yeah,
upholding journalistic integrity, but they're all saying it at the same time. I just felt
it's
like I was listening
terrifying.
to some sort of like North Korean propaganda or like Nazi propaganda. It was
Yeah,
truly
I'm gonna share
terrifying to
that
see
on
that.
our Instagram so people can see it because I love that video.
Yeah. Um,
But this,
but
but this, I think gets at there's really two types of fake news, and one of them
yeah.
is a lot more sinister than the other.
Yeah.
The less sinister one is where they're just trying to sell products and they'll bend truth a little bit to really get you to buy. And this is like the classic, Facebook marketer trying to, you know, have good high conversions and trying to get high engagement on their content. And that's something Facebook and Google are very familiar with. And
Yeah.
over time, I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to iron out those quality, the quality and getting the right sort of feed in place for each of those platforms. But the
Yeah.
more sinister type is when there's really big money, big corporations pulling the strings and pushing an agenda.
Hmm.
And there's even, if you have, heard it all about Murdoch's rise to power and the Murdoch empire, it's really fascinating. But there's even the so-called Murdoch playbook, which is basically how he achieved success and was able to create this huge media empire. And the
Hmm.
Murdoch playbook is essentially do right by people who are the decision makers, and they'll do right by you. So even
Hmm.
though there are antitrust laws in place where you can't own more than two newspapers in the UK because they don't want anyone swaying public opinion for their own reasons,
Hmm.
um, that Rupert Murdoch went there and basically supported Margaret Thatcher with his two existing newspapers, helped get her elected, and then once she was elected, she basically turned a blind eye when he went and bought the third newspaper. And he did the same exact thing in the US, where he helped Ronald Reagan's rise to power, and then once Ronald Reagan was in office, he also turned a blind eye, and Murdoch expanded his empire. And this same pattern is taking place across a couple different major corporations. But you
Yeah.
can see where it's just like, you scratch your back, I'll scratch mine. And even though
Hmm.
it's not what's best for the people, hey, it's really good for me. And I only really care about my direct descendants, anyways. So, you know, let's just
Hmm.
have this mutually beneficial arrangement. And oftentimes it's unspoken. But
Yeah.
that's what I really worry about. That type of fake news where it's pre planned out and where there's alliances among the people in power and the people that are supposed to be regulating these
Yeah.
media empires. That's what I'm most worried about.
Yeah, I mean the truly scary thing about all of this too is, well, one, the public opinion on various things in the past have been swayed because of these sorts of news outlets that have way too much power. Like all of the like the drug hysteria, whether that's
Hmm.
cannabis or psychedelics back, in the 50s and 60s, that was all based on, well, there's several different people that didn't want it to happen, particularly the tobacco industry, particularly
Right.
um, I think I forgot the name of this guy, but Joe Rogan talks about him all the time, where he was the one who had a whole bunch of forests that produce paper. But it turns out that hemp is probably a way more sustainable way to produce paper and
Right.
cheaper. So this guy, I really need to look up the name of him, but he basically he owned a whole bunch of newspapers and basically said that hemp, it makes black people rape and kill our women basically,
Wow.
or Mexicans, and like these sorts of news. I mean, reading this sort of news made people think that all drugs were bad, and it made people bad, and it made people rape and kill our women.
And there's another one that was said that when people take LSD, they go blind. And there was like this whole scare that people thought
Oh
they were going to
yeah,
go blind. And it was like
because they just like
totally,
look up into the sun or
yeah, like
something.
it was
Yeah.
totally bunk science, but bunk reporting.
Yeah, and there's so many different things like that. I mean, I think sugar was another one, smoking was another one. Like there's a whole
Right.
bunch of pieces that can sway public opinion that is truly bad for society, but the people that are in power that can, run these stories benefit from, the rest of society not benefiting and,
Right.
being hurt. So,
It's
yeah,
just
it's
really
so
hard to
bad.
know like which sources you can trust also,
Hmm.
which I think that's partly why, part of what's different about being a journalist today is that you're kind of like a mini celebrity. I mean, if you follow journalists on Twitter, they are a force in their own right. above and
Mhm.
beyond what their actual publication is. And I think part of that's because people really want someone that they know they can trust. And if they have some sort of rapport with this journalist, then and they sort of know that okay, they think in the same way as I do on a number of important issues, then they're more likely to listen to this person, to what they have to say about the next issue that comes up. So I think that's going to become a bigger and bigger trend of people wanting to trust reporters, and also people wanting to trust, you know, certain brand names. Like the New York
Yeah.
Times stock price has just gone up, you know,
Mhm.
over time, whereas other media have just, you know, completely gone downwards. And
Mhm.
that's partially because New York Times has presented itself as a trustworthy news source that's worth paying for.
Yeah.
And this also gets at the business model because there's really two competing business models. There's the subscription model where people are really only going to pay if they really value the quality of the information. If they
Mhm.
think that by accessing the information you have, they'll be better suited to live their life, then they'll pay for it. But
Mhm.
the advertising model is the other model, and that's all just, it doesn't matter what happens after they click so long as they click. So even if
Mhm.
it's a total lie, even if you're completely misrepresenting reality, if it gets them to click, then you're making money. And that's just, you know, circles the drain of content to just get, you know, basic crap.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of points to, I mean, you can look at both of those and, it's obvious which one it has better aligned incentives with the end consumer. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously when we're talking about the one where you pay for high quality content, that's when the incentives are aligned. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're talking about, just what is the most sensational thing that'll get the most views and most ad clicks or whatever the ad revenue is, that that sort of model means that they're just putting out as much information as humanly possible, where news stories don't even last for more than like 3 days. Like even the biggest stories last 3 days because it's on to the next thing to make sure that there's
Right.
always a stream of new clicks and eyes coming onto their site, or listens,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
But this is a relatively new phenomenon. So CNN created the 24-hour news cycle not that long ago.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Before then, it was just you had the nightly news,
Hmm.
and that's the most you would listen to it. But I actually think the trend may have bottomed out, meaning it may have gotten as bad as it's going to get as far as people just having shallow surface level news. Because the trend, as I see it from a high level, is that we had everyone was sort of in the same mindset with these, like, you know, few big news sources. And then we went into the 24-hour news where there's only so much stuff going on in the world at any given time. So it was a lot of rehashing the same things, a lot of small sound bites, like interview segments. And then, you know, with Twitter's early rise, it was all about these like short form, sort of snackable content. But
Hmm.
now I'm seeing more of a move towards more holistic, nuanced, in
Yeah.
depth, deep dives into content itself.
Hmm.
And especially with the rise of not just investigative journalists, but data scientists who work with investigative journalists,
Yeah.
that's a really positive indicator from what I'm seeing. Like, for
Hmm.
instance, the New York Times just had this fantastic piece about facial recognition technology
Yeah.
where, you know, rather than just having the typical like three anecdotes of like three people you happen to talk to, which is not real data science, it's just like
Yeah.
storytelling.
Yeah. Pretty
Instead
much.
of that, they actually had a camera in Bryant Park in New York City capturing the facial patterns of thousands of people every day. And they showed how they're able to map out all of these people, who they are, where they're going, who they're meeting, all these private details about their life. And it was such a better way of getting at the essence of the facial technology issue than to
Hmm.
just like ask three people what they think about it.
Yeah.
And I see that more and more, especially Axios, the markup. There are some really
Hmm.
great news outlets that are taking this sort of data science plus investigative journalism approach.
Yeah.
And I really think that can be powerful if used for good. If it's
Yeah.
used for manipulation to drive an agenda, then obviously that's terrible.
Yeah. See, the thing I really liked when so you shared that news article with me, and it really stood out to me in a few different ways. So the first thing with this New York Times article is they had this almost like a slide deck in the very beginning. I just viewed
Mm-hmm.
it on my phone and you went through and it just gave you the key pointers of the story. Like this is it, just straight facts, no opinion.
Right.
This is what it was, and then it kind of gave a visualization of what's actually happening. And then also the way the story was written, it almost lets you form your own opinion about what's going on because it
Mm.
presents it in a way that's so unbiased. It's just like, oh, this is what's happening. What do I think about it? Rather than here's what is possible with artificial intelligence. It's bad, right? So
Right,
it's
right.
so I like the way that they did that, and I think that is one thing, you know, that I would like to see in the future a little bit more, to let people form their own opinions rather than being told what their opinion should be about stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
totally. I mean, this kind of gets at just what I think about the news in general, where if we're able to agree on the facts,
mhm.
then the more opinions, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
If we cannot agree on the facts,
Mhm.
then the more opinions, the worse, because
Yeah.
it's just you cannot start to solve a problem unless you agree that the problem is real, and you can't agree
Mhm.
a problem is real unless you agree on the facts. So, even though a lot of people say local news is what is the foundation of journalism, I think
Mhm.
really the facts are the foundation of journalism. And whenever
Yeah.
you write an article that's supposed to be somewhat scholarly or reputable, you
Mhm.
always need to reference some sort of data. And
Mhm.
not all data sources are created equal. If you reference Pew Research or some .gov source,
Yeah.
that'll be way more respected than if you just reference like, Social Media Examiner or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that that's going to be a really important facet of the future of news is whether we're able to effectively have the same data that everyone can reference, and then you can spin off whatever opinions you want, but as long as it's rooted in that data. Or if it's going to become like everyone has their own data and alternative facts, like that kind of a
Yeah.
world is a scary world, and I hope we don't go in that direction.
Yeah, and that's the other problem I see, especially when journalists try to report on scientific findings. Because basically, an entire scientific paper that took anywhere from like 5 to 20 really in-depth pages to write, they're trying to distill it in a way that everyone can read. And depending on which news sources reading it, they'll focus on potentially totally insignificant parts of the findings.
Right.
So, like if for climate change research, they'll focus on something that's, you know, kind of points to the fact that, oh, this has always happened. So this is why. Every climate change paper knows that cycles have happened in the past. But, what they will dismiss then is, everything else about the humans causing what, all of this climate change. So with scientific papers, journalists can focus on different things because
Hmm.
there is so much data there. And then the other problem that I think we should talk about is the idea that sometimes we, like even the best journalists that are trying to be as nuanced as possible, they might see some content that is from a seemingly reputable source, but it's fake, like deepfakes.
Totally.
So if we can generate, Donald Trump or Barack Obama saying something that
Yeah.
is totally, it would paint them in a really bad light, you know, that is something that is pretty much possible right now. And since
Right.
we're doing all of these recordings with our voice, there's definitely going to be enough audio content of us for anyone in the future to, make us say whatever they want us to say.
Right.
And
Right.
and that's sort of scary to think about. So we need some way to really have a ground truth for everything.
Yeah, totally. And I've heard some people say that they think the deep fake concern is overblown, that it will be really hard for someone to really, in the long run, make everyone think that this is a real video.
Uh-huh.
However, the damage may already be done, even when people realize later that it's fake. It's kind of
Yeah.
like if you're in a in a debate, a political debate, and your opponent
Mhm.
asks you, "When did you stop beating your wife?" It's like there's nothing you can say that will
Like,
help the situation. Just the fact that he asked you that question is going to be
uh-huh.
bad for how the public perceives you. And in the
Yeah.
same way, if you make a fake video of someone doing something horrible, even if you know it's
Mhm.
not real, that image is still embedded in your mind. And
Yeah.
it's going to be there subliminally for X amount of time. And if that's the time that you're taking to make the decision of whether to vote for that person or not, then that has a
Mhm.
real impact. Um,
Yeah.
now,
I
what?
mean,
Go ahead.
well, so the thing with video, I think, is that that'll probably be a little bit hard to do in the long term to make people think that this didn't happen. What I think will be easier is just audio. So, for example, and this isn't me, like, I don't know what happened in this case. I don't know if the technology is there yet. But the whole Donald Trump thing in the bus when he said, grab her by the pussy or
Oh
whatever,
yeah, yeah. The
like
Hollywood Access
that was
Hollywood.
all audio. So
Right,
so
right,
that that sort of thing could be potentially done to anybody.
right,
Like you could make anybody say anything without actually having the audio or the video to be associated with that, which would be easier to accomplish, which is
right.
sort of scary, especially with the rise of audio in general.
Totally.
Um,
I mean, the best solution that I've heard for this problem is if you can have some sort of authentication that
uh,
proves that this video was filmed on this device in this location on this date. And we already have that to some extent. I mean, there is metadata. If you film something on your iPhone, it stamps the location, the time, and the device ID. So we
yeah.
already have the building blocks to have that authentication. And I think it's going to get even better over time, especially as these tech companies battle for privacy, because that seems to be a
Hmm.
major trend. Like Apple's biggest asset is the fact that people know that what happens on your iPhone stays on your iPhone. And the
Hmm.
fact that Facebook is moving from connecting everyone to just
Hmm.
bringing people closer together in the ways that they want and basically creating privacy walls for everyone they don't want to be connected with. I mean, that's kind of their Facebook's
Yeah.
new pivot.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be better and better ways of authenticating whether this video actually was filmed on the device and at the time and in the location that they said it was.
Hmm.
But like I said, even if you can debunk a video after the fact or an audio clip, it still can do a lot of damage.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, think about like public stocks or something along those lines. If you were to do some sort of slander of a CEO or some big stakeholder, or there was a secret recording of a big deal that went through to
Hmm.
artificially rise a stock price for a short period of time, even if that stock rise even if that is figured out within 10 minutes, it doesn't matter. The stock could have already gone up, let's say even 1%.
Right.
Whoever, if the adversary is, also trading stocks, to sway general opinion. Obviously, it's illegal to do this market manipulation, but if you're secretive enough, then you could probably pull it off. And that's another kind of scary thing where the damage can be done in a super short period of time, even if you know in a relatively short period of time the truth is figured out. So
Right.
so that's one issue. But like you said, there are ways that we can authenticate. Um, I think that metadata can be manipulated, which is an issue. But there are things where data could be put on some sort of blockchain immediately when it's created,
Hmm.
and then we can know exactly that like this piece of data is unfalsifiable. It definitely happened, and
Right.
that's one of those uses for blockchain that is potentially going to be key in the future of figuring out what is true and keeping the truth kind of, or keeping a ground or base of truth available to the public.
Mm.
And I hope that can happen.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, the news is also susceptible to this kind of deep fakes or any sort of faking of the news because it's typically one time only consumption.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about, because, we did the future of media as a past episode, and I was thinking, what's really unique about the news as opposed to other forms of media? And what's unique is that it's one time only. You may have, you may listen this morning to, um, Artie Shaw or some jazz
Hmm.
musician who lived hundreds of years ago, but you probably didn't listen to, or you probably didn't read like a newspaper article from the time that Jimmy Carter was president. Like
Yep.
no one reads the news more than a week after it's happened for the
Hmm.
most part. So it's really tough business when you compare it
Hmm.
to, say, the music business or to writing novels or
Hmm.
to nonfiction content that's evergreen. And
Yep.
that's been part of the problem is that it's such an important facet of any democracy. Like people call it like the fourth legislative branch kind of. It's like the
Hmm.
independent press is really key. Yet
Yep.
it's a really hard business to make money. So one of the possible solutions that I've been thinking about is if the news was more like a publicly provided um,
Mm.
utility, kind
Yeah.
of like how the government already pays for NPR, National Public Radio.
Yeah.
They pay for
Hmm.
other form, PBS. They pay
Yep.
for other forms of content. And if the government can play a bigger role here, but maybe establish an independent agency that is not at all influenced by the money of corporations or by political agendas, which that in itself would be difficult. But if we
Hmm.
were able to establish that, and the news can really just be about reporting the most accurate facts possible, and it's funded by the government, so they don't have to worry about, oh,
Hmm.
are we making enough? Do we have enough monthly uniques? And
Yep.
if instead of focusing on any sort of opinion, it just focused on the facts and the government kind of provided those facts, that could
Hmm.
be a good solution if executed well.
Yeah. The one issue there would be if, are these journalists supposed to investigate the government itself? Like, is the government, you know, part of the influencing power of whatever organization this is? It doesn't seem that case with something like NPR because it is sort of an independent organization and it just, I don't know exactly how it works, but it's probably like subsidies or something from the government or, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
don't know
sure
enough
if you
about
know,
how it
but
works, but I know that the people that are attracted to work at NPR or PBS are very independent minded.
yeah.
So for that reason alone, it seems much more trustworthy than, Fox
Hmm.
or MSNBC.
Hmm.
So I think that is a possible good long-term solution as long as it can stay independent.
Yeah, that's the issue is how can these stay independent? But I mean, having a board that is broad enough with people on all sides of the spectrum, that would probably be the best way to have some sort of oversight committee, I guess, like a board that isn't going to be swayed or
Right.
has a whole bunch of diverse
Well, we've
opinions.
talked about this before, the Ministry of Truth,
Yeah.
which could backfire if the wrong person's in power.
Yeah, yeah. If there's too much power to one specific person, it, I wonder what this is a little off topic, but I wonder what the optimal structure of a board would be. Like how many people do you actually need to make sure that there isn't any chance of it, or there's a really low chance of money influencing the decision of a board? Like, does it need to be a dozen? Does it need to be 3 dozen? Um,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it could also be the case that if you had the right sort of AI system that could give a confidence interval for any given fact, like imagine if there was a
mhm,
public resource where you could type in any fact or any link or any sentence and it would
mhm,
give you the confidence interval on whether or not this is true.
mhm,
And then you could access whatever data set. Hopefully, it's open source so people know exactly how it's calculating these confidence intervals. But I mean, it's really hard to obviously create that sort of system. But if we
yeah.
had some bedrock of truth where everyone can go check this one website
Mhm,
and it's open source so we know it's not doing anything nefarious, that
mhm.
would be a great outcome, I think.
Yeah, and I think that would all start with a good source of data, like a ground truth data, whether those are scientific peer-reviewed papers, which have, issues in and of themselves, depending on what the field is. But the other thing too is we could have these sources of all like video and audio archives that some system can go through and kind of check, does this sentence match up with something that actually happened,
Hmm.
and it can actually go check a database. It can just
Right.
query and see if this is true.
Now, the one thing that's really tricky about this is that something can be true and it can still mislead you.
Yeah.
Like for instance, the way that you phrase something can totally change public opinion. And I know this really well as a marketer, where, for
Hmm.
instance, if you, like, most people are against the death tax, but they're for the estate tax for wealthy individuals. And they're the exact same thing. Most
Just the
people
way that you phrase it.
most people are against illegal aliens, but they're okay with undocumented workers filling gaps in the job market. And they're the exact
Yeah.
same thing. So it's like
Yeah.
the words that you use, even if it's accurate and factual, you can still manipulate people just based on the language that you're using.
Hmm.
So
I wonder if there would be a way to, like, so if you query a system, because we talk about this a lot, to have some sort of credibility checker.
mhm.
Um, and if you could get a, yes, this is true, these are all the different ways that you could say the same thing. This is how biased this specific statement is. So it's like credibility, bias, the, you know,
Right, right.
the hidden meanings in this, like all of the different things that you would want to know.
And this is not so far fetched because Google now has a an algorithm that doesn't just read the dumb keywords and spit out associated keywords. It actually comprehends what's being typed into the search engine.
Hmm.
So it's called rank brain as opposed to page rank. So
Interesting. Yeah.
so I actually think that this is much more feasible than most people would assume.
Hmm.
And it really gets into what could be possible in the future scenarios as we think about how AI, these big tech companies, and the interplay with data and journalists and
Hmm.
different narratives and different powers pushing different agendas, how that can all coalesce into the worst case, the best case, and the most likely outcome. So,
Maybe that's a good time to get into it then.
yeah, let's do it. All right, we'll take a quick break and then we'll get into future scenarios. All right, Justin, what do you think is the worst case scenario for the future of news?
Worst case scenario.
Yeah, so I have a few things that are, it's kind of a multifaceted worst case scenario. So, one is there still tends to be misaligned incentives for news agencies and big broadcasting companies where we ultimately end up with the continuation of super biased journalism and super biased stories. So that's one thing. And then as this continues, we'll start to see propaganda be a thing. I mean, it really is a thing already, but um, same thing like with the whole Sinclair deal. We'll start to see these topics pushed that will, be in the interest of corporations that are paying for these stories. And I think this is all due to misaligned incentives. The other thing that I think is part of the worst case scenario is that there's so much information, and I think the amount of information that's being generated and the amount of content continues to increase. And in the worst case scenario, there's just so much information that no one can truly parse what's happening and what like how the world is actually working. And I think that's an issue, especially when you have these journalists that are going out and really putting their life on the line to get a story to really um, uncover something that is truly sinister about the nature of how some country or some company or something is going on. But there's so much information that all of this stuff can just get covered up.
Hmm.
Um, and then another worst case is we have realistic AI video voice generation that can basically make anyone say or do anything that they want. which, like we talked about, that might be a short-term thing, but the damage can be done in the short term. Um, and then as news cycles get shorter and shorter, there like no one even knows what to keep up with anymore. So there's like there's no sense of priority of what are the biggest stories, and who, like, what should we even be paying attention to as people. And
Mm.
with the shorter and shorter news cycles, um, we can basically forget about everything that happens. So if, like, for example, we see this kind of with the whole Trump presidency. Like, there's just so much that gets spewed out that you can't keep up with everything.
Hmm.
So there's just new stories every 10 minutes about what's going on. And that makes us kind of lose track of what's truly important about, or what the true issues are with this presidency. Or, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this presidency. It'll be companies or something else.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's a lot of really bad things that can happen with all of those. And those are kind of my worst case scenarios.
Yeah, mine is pretty similar, where it seems like a lot of the people who are already in power, they have an incentive to stop any sort of progress that will ruffle the feathers of their empire or whatever advantages they currently have. So I
Hmm.
could see a system where there's enough misinformation in the news consistently that a large swath of the population is not focused on what are actually the most important problems of our time, and instead they're focused on non-issues.
Hmm.
And we're seeing this right now, where I would say the two biggest problems of our time is AI,
Yep.
including like autonomous weaponry and runaway AI, and climate change. Those are the two biggest issues facing us right now. And the
Hmm.
more that we're focused on tribal issues, like, oh, those people aren't like us, they're not
Yeah.
good, they don't have the real good Christian values, and just all of those issues are so much less important than existential threats to humanity and to life as
Hmm.
a whole on our planet. And the problem is that you don't have to convince everyone that these aren't issues. You just have to convince like 30 or 40% of the population that it's fake, and then there won't be enough momentum to actually solve these critical issues.
Hmm.
So for me, the technology is amoral. It could be used for good, it could be used for bad. But if
Yeah.
the people who are pulling the strings are just out for themselves and for their short-term success, and they don't really care about the long-term habitability of the planet,
Hmm.
or the fact that AI may do some pretty terrible things if we're not careful,
Hmm.
then that could lead to any number of the horrible scenarios that we've talked about on past episodes.
Hmm. Yeah, totally agree. What do you think for the best case?
Best case scenario.
Yeah, so for the best case, I was actually thinking a lot about Max Tegmark's book Life 3.0 in this scenario, because in Life 3.0, they create a runaway AI that's more intelligent than any other AI, and it becomes a media mogul in its own right. So it
Hmm.
starts creating all of these. First, they're just like CGI animated films because
Hmm.
you don't have to hire anyone else to do that. And then eventually, once it gets good enough, it can actually create like real people that look identical, that goes beyond the uncanny valley where you would
Hmm.
have no idea this isn't a real person. And then they basically create news stations all over the world. They hire some real journalists so it doesn't look suspicious. And it's like, and then it pushes people towards the middle rather than pushing
Yeah.
them towards the extremes. So it focuses on the commonality of human experiences, not the divergences of human
Hmm.
experience. And this results in much greater collaboration. People are able to address the real problems. People are able to
Hmm.
focus on what really matters in life because they're not being misdirected in all these different ways. And so I could see a scenario where there's an AI that is really sort of doing what's best and focusing on truthfulness and what's actually most important. And so
Hmm.
in that sense, it pushes us towards like what we should actually be spending our time on. and
Yeah.
it's easily able to debunk anything that's not factually correct. And if
Yeah.
this is combined with just many nuanced opinions of people being able to, democratize the news, essentially, I mean, that's what's happening. And
Hmm.
in the best case, if Google and Facebook and Apple and other sites, Twitter, continue to improve their algorithms so that they're giving people what is valuable to them and not just
Hmm.
giving them what is going to get them to click, like what's most outrageous or what
Yeah.
makes them, they've done studies about what gets people to actually share, what emotions get people to share. And it's
Hmm.
anger, it's titillage, it's curiosity, it's like surprise, but no one
Yeah.
shares something when they're sad or when it's
Yeah.
boring,
Right.
right? Or when it's just nice.
And a
Like,
lot of things are boring too. Like a lot of important things tend to be boring.
right, like,
So,
pension funds and tax
yeah.
reform and
Yeah.
yeah, so I guess if we used AI, and even if it's not like some new AI newcomer that comes and does all these unexpected things, even if it's, say, Google search that just gets better and better and better at
Hmm.
prioritizing information that's reputable over that which is not, then that'll
Hmm.
have huge effects on all of society. I mean, the amount of control that just Facebook and Google have over the news industry is incredible. So how
Yeah.
they respond is big, and then there are only five news corporations or five media companies that control 90% of everything we hear and see. And it used to be 50 companies back in the 80s. So there's been major consolidation. So when I
Wow.
look towards the future, it's like what these five companies do and what these two social media companies do is
Hmm.
basically going to write the future history.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's super important that Facebook and Google can get this right, and Twitter, like all these tech companies that are involved in this.
And they have
Um,
pretty good indicators. Like it seems like they're
yeah.
moving in the right direction.
And yeah, I think the nice thing is that they seem to care. Like there's
Hmm.
not evil people running these companies. I think the incentives with the economy as a whole were just the way it played out with their current companies. Like it led to some not so great things in Facebook's and Twitter's case, for example.
Right, but it
Um,
was more collateral damage than a premeditated
yeah,
hit on
exactly.
democracy.
Yeah, it's not like they set out to be evil and do things that were bad for
Right.
society, but it just kind of happened.
It's like
Um,
Kara Swisher has this quote where she says that Facebook didn't get hacked by the Russians. It got used exactly as Facebook was intended to be used,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
scary in its own right, but that also means they can fix the way that you use Facebook so that it's not as
mhm,
easily exploitable.
yeah, yeah. And as for my best case, mine was actually really similar to yours. So in the short term, best case would be we can really start to focus on truth. Truth, almost in the sense that we treat journalism as we treat scientific peer-reviewed studies, where everyone's trying to poke holes in stories, and all these other journalists are working to figure out how true everything is. Obviously, this maybe it's not other journalists, but maybe it's a an AI that isn't actually creating content, but it's the sort of credibility check that we were talking about
Hmm.
earlier. So everything kind of gets a stamp of approval or a score
Right.
based on, whatever they're writing.
Like imagine if
And
you're in Google and every news article has a little like Rotten Tomatoes score next to it.
yeah, pretty much. Obviously, they're boiling it all down to one score might be hard because if you're truly an investigative journalist, you are basically the only source of data.
Mm.
You and I mean, obviously if you're a good investigative journalist, you uncover different sources, but you somehow need to publish your news sources. And if your source is super, you know, someone that is really in hiding, that's obviously another issue.
Hmm.
How is this AI system gonna going to figure that out. But, let's assume that it's a super intelligent AI that has access to everything. Um, but anyways, so that's kind of the short term, is to just realign the incentives to focus on truth rather than to focus on the number of eyes and then the amount of revenue
Engagement.
yeah, basically.
Hmm.
Um, but long term, again, kind of like you were saying, is we have an AI system that can just tell us that, this could obviously easily go to a worst case scenario, but if it is a benign AI that's really just trying to tell everybody and inform humanity of what's truly going on, and it can also tell the different opinions of people. Like it's this news source that kind of fulfills this truth gap that we're seeing. That
Right. Well, I want to touch on one thing you said earlier, which is that it would be far better if news organizations were optimizing for truth as opposed to engagement. And I
mhm,
totally agree with you. My question is, how can that happen? Like, how can we align incentives so that news organizations actually benefit by focusing on the truth as opposed to focusing on what gets clicks? Already there are some downsides to being hyper partisan. So, for
yeah,
instance, Tucker Carlson has basically no blue chip advertisers left on his program. The only advertiser left is like My Pillow, NRA, GOP. Like there's no
uh,
mainstream companies that advertise on his show. So
mhm,
if we took that a little further, and maybe if you are a news source that's focused on the truth as opposed to an opinion source that's just focused on opinions,
mhm,
you should have access to all of these blue chip advertisers. Whereas maybe if you're more opinion focused, partisan focused, then you don't have access to those advertisers. I mean, that would be like a just officializing something that's sort of already happening in the
yeah. So it's
system, but
harder to get funding if you're more biased. Basically, is that
yeah,
kind of
like
what you're?
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, advertisers, because what happens is Tucker Carlson says something crazy on his show and racist, and
Uh huh.
then all these people on Twitter reach out to any advertiser and say, "You got to pull it, or else I'm never buying Tide Pods again." And
Yeah.
then Tide pulls their ads. Tucker Carlson loses a lot of money. They'll get other
Mhm.
advertisers, but those advertisers aren't going to pay as much as the high-end blue chip advertisers. So there
Yeah.
already are some repercussions, but
Mhm.
if there were greater repercussions, then that would align incentives
Mhm.
more fully.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing that Sam Harris talks about, is if there was truly a social problem with you spewing falsehoods, then that would pretty much solve most
Right.
of the problems we see in the news. Like if you were socially ostracized for being a shill for something, like that would
Hmm.
that would be good. But I think the issue is we don't have that in place, and the people that have the funding and fund these sorts of news stories tend to have all the power,
Right.
whereas the ground,
And it's
the
really hard to litigate because free speech is so prized in our
yeah,
country,
which is
which
that's
is
obviously a
good.
good thing.
But it's kind of like, the classic ruling that you have free speech, but you don't have freedom to shout fire in a crowded movie theater.
Yeah.
But I think what we're seeing in the news is something almost approaching that shouting fire in a crowded movie theater, which is like, if an asteroid's coming towards Earth and you say,
Mhm.
oh no, it's bunk science, that's like, that's pretty bad. And we're seeing similar things where people downplay the real problems of the day and they
Yeah.
misdirect with other issues that they want to talk about.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that ultimately we have to align incentives, and this goes for pretty much everything that we've talked about in the podcast. Like
Hmm.
a lot of it boils down to the misaligned incentives, whether that's healthcare or something else. We just need to make sure incentives are aligned.
Yeah, you have to
Um,
make it easy to be a good person and hard to be a bad person. Right now,
yeah,
it's easy to be a bad person when it comes to the news.
And just, I mean, just the way the system in general is designed. Yeah, like you were saying, it's easy enough. Like if you have power and you have your own self-interest in mind, you know, it's easy enough to just throw money at somebody to, you know, especially like scientific papers. Since so one
Mm.
thing that really bothers me is back, I think it was back in the 50s or 60s, a couple Harvard scientists were paid like $50,000 over the course of a year or something from someone in the sugar industry, which basically said saturated fat is bad, sugar is not bad, kind of
Mm.
thing.
Right,
So
right.
that, I mean, that skewed the whole scientific
Yeah.
world in the dietary space for several decades,
Yeah.
just because there was a little bit of money. I mean, $50,000 to literally ruin the health of the country, pretty much. Like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that may be a little extreme, but like it's just
That's
bad when
terrible.
the incentives are misaligned like that. And
Right.
scientific papers are, you know, it's part of news because it ultimately becomes news.
Hmm.
So yeah, what do you think for the likely scenario?
Most likely scenario.
Yeah, so for my most likely scenario, I definitely don't think conspiracies are going away anytime soon
Hmm.
because conspiracies are really does what's the right word? They're psychologically very attractive to people
Yeah. Hmm.
because they make you feel like you have some secret knowledge that other people don't have, and therefore
Hmm.
you're superior to these other people that think they
Hmm.
know what's going on, but really only you know the truth, or you and your small group of tribesmen know the
Yeah.
truth. And
You and your other flat earthers.
right. I mean, flat Earth is a great example. Another great example is Pizzagate. So
Oh yeah.
at the time, Pizzagate was big, which is basically the no.
Maybe tell the story of
Yeah.
pizza. Okay.
So in 2016 there was this notion that Hillary Clinton had a child sex ring at the basement of this pizza parlor in DC called Comet Pizza.
Hmm.
And this became such a widespread talking point on conservative media, and especially on a lot of these like far right blogs, that at a certain point there was a poll. 50% of Trump supporters in this poll believed that Hillary Clinton does in fact have a child sex ring in the basement of this pizza parlor. And what ended up happening is some guy actually went there with a semi-automatic rifle and demanded to see where the basement was because he thought he was doing this heroic act and finally like freeing the people in this Pizzagate
Yeah.
scenario. And it turns out there isn't even a basement in this Comet Pizza. It's like, so that just shows how the desire to have this secret knowledge is just really attractive psychologically. So I
Hmm.
don't think that that's ever going away. There's always going to
Hmm.
be some percentage of the population that are just drawn to that like moth to a
Hmm.
flame.
Yeah.
However, I think the current undercurrent of people who really want nuanced opinions, who listen to, multi-hour podcasts, who, go on Netflix and watch One Strange Rock, and people that are really
Hmm.
interested in figuring out what's really real. I think
Hmm.
that trend is also going to rise. And
Hmm.
the question is what happens to the people in the middle, right? The big
Hmm.
chunk of the population in the big fat section of that bell curve.
Yeah.
And I think that is largely going to be determined by how the social media channels construct their algorithms, how they decide to prioritize information. I mean, you brought
Hmm.
up the point about scholarly scientific articles and the
Hmm.
importance of bringing to top the ones that are really credible and don't have
Hmm.
special interest money behind them, as opposed to the ones that are basically just being paid to have a certain result. So if
Hmm.
Google can, within Google Scholar, prioritize the right
Hmm.
articles, and in Google News prioritize the right news based on accuracy and importance,
Hmm.
then that'll result in a much better society that's able to collaborate on the problems that really matter, which you talked about
Hmm.
in the beginning. And so I'm actually optimistic in the most likely scenario because I all of the indicators are showing that these companies are trying to do right by society. And if so long as that trend continues, I'm very hopeful that the future of news is looking bright.
Yeah, I'm with you too. I feel fairly optimistic about the future of news, especially with the rise of podcasts and these people that have more centrist philosophies that just try to be reasonable. Like, I know not everybody likes Joe Rogan, but I think Joe Rogan is so important to society right now. I think he gets like a couple 100 million listens per month.
He gets 200 million listens per month. The single biggest news network, CNN, and then Fox, they're kind of neck and neck. They get 2 million. Joe Rogan gets 10x what CNN or Fox get. I mean, it's incredible.
And I just think it's so important too, because he's not one that really
100x. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous that he has this sort of power, but he doesn't try to push anything. I mean, yeah, he has opinions about stuff, which is fine, but he also brings on guests that have different opinions from him. It's not like this huge echo chamber that he's creating. He's just trying to be reasonable about things. And I think that's kind of opening people's eyes that, oh, there's another way to look at things. I should probably be more reasonable. I should probably do these things that make me just a better human, right? And I think just this rise
he focuses on the topic rather than the ideology.
Yeah, and that's the thing we saw with when Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, went on for the first time. He just asked him about his life, like, who is Jack Dorsey? He got a lot of pushback because he didn't, grind Jack Dorsey enough to get all this information out. But it's, I just think it's really good that we have people like him. We have people like Sam Harris, who doesn't even take ads at all because he doesn't want to have the influence of some sort of agency or some money that potentially could stop if he says something wrong. So I think that we're just going to continue to see this sort of thing rising. And I still think podcasts are a pretty small part of the whole news media, the whole news space, which is awesome because there's a lot of room to grow still. Because I would say out of everybody I know, there's still a fairly small percentage of those people that regularly listen to podcasts. And I just think with the rise of podcasts and with the rise of this divisiveness and this polarity, people are starting to see like, oh, maybe being this extreme is not good. Maybe I think eventually there's just gonna, like, everything's just expanding so much. Eventually it's just gonna come crashing to the center, or at least I hope that a lot of the people start to drift more towards the center because they realize how outrageous it is to be so biased. So I think that's kind of where it will go eventually. I just wonder how far we have to stretch before contracting again towards the center. We'll see.
Right. I kind of feel like the worst is actually already behind us. But I think a lot is going to determine what happens in 2020. Because 2020 could be an indicator that, oh, no, the worst is still yet to come. Or we could, it could be in the past. So. Yeah,
I'm hopeful. I think that will be an issue. I mean, I think it'll be cyclical too. I think there will be a time in the future where we become more and more biased, or there's more polarity in the whole news space and information space. And again, it's probably just going to contract and expand over time. So we'll see. I mean, I'm very curious to see what happens over our lifetimes with news.
Yeah. So am I.
We are all gathered here today.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you everyone for listening. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us.
About what has happened,
gmail.com.
what is currently happening, and what will inevitably happen.
The past, the present.